62nd floor Pierce Tower glittered like a chandelier suspended over the Chicago skyline. Inside, the annual Gala of Pierce and Vail Capital unfolded with the careful choreography of old money. A string quartet played near the western corner. Servers in black and white moved between linen-covered tables. The marble floor reflected the warm fall of light from 3 enormous chandeliers. In rooms like this, who shook whose hand first carried the weight of policy. A smile here was rarely just a smile. A turned shoulder was rarely just a turned shoulder. Rosalind Pierce stepped into that room at 37 minutes past 8. She wore a midnight blue gown cut with a deep V at the collar. Her dark hair had been left loose, brushed over one shoulder. She was 28 years old. She was the chief executive of Pierce and Vail Capital. She was the daughter of the man whose name still carried the building's anchor, and tonight, of all nights, she should have been the center of every conversation she walked toward. But the moment her heels touched the marble, the room shifted. A cluster of senior directors, near the bar, had been laughing, and the laughter ended a half-second too cleanly. A senior partner in a charcoal suit saw her, registered her, and turned toward the man on his left, as though he had just remembered something urgent to say. A junior associate raised her glass to greet Amanda Gray, the head of internal communications, and somehow looked past Rosalind even though Rosalind was standing directly behind her. Rosalind kept walking. She kept her shoulders square. She kept the small, controlled smile she had inherited from her father. But anyone looking carefully, and only one man in the room was looking that carefully, would have seen the small tightening in her hand when she lifted a flute from a passing tray. She did not drink from it. She simply held it, the way a swimmer might hold a breath. A chief executive was standing at the center of her own gala, and the room had agreed, without any meeting and without any vote, that she was no longer there. To understand the silence, one had to step back several weeks. The proposed deal was called the Meridian Acquisition. On paper, it was the kind of arrangement that made analysts at every other firm in the city quietly envious. Pierce and Vail Capital would absorb a smaller fund, expand its asset portfolio, lift its short-term earnings. Corbin Vale, vice-chairman of the board, had described it as the necessary next step to protect what he called the legacy of this house. Rosalind had not disagreed with the strategy. She had disagreed with one set of numbers buried in the appendix. Inside the proposed restructuring sat a population of small retirement clients, accounts that belonged to school teachers, retired nurses, factory floor supervisors, owners of corner stores, men and women who had built their savings out of decades of caution. After the merger, those clients would be moved into a new pooled product with a higher exposure profile. On the model, the pooled product looked elegant. But Rosalind had spent 4 nights at her father's old desk reading the underlying assumptions, and she had seen a thinness in them that the surface gloss could not cover. If the bond market turned, those quiet, modest accounts would absorb the first wave of the loss. The school teachers might watch 15 years of patience evaporate inside a single quarter. She had asked for the original risk report. She had been given a clean executive summary. She had been told that Carter Nolan, the manager of the risk team, had personally signed off. Corbin had taken her aside and reminded her that her father had also faced moments when sentiment had to bow to scale. He had said her father would have signed. Rosalind had not signed. She had told the room that she was withholding executive approval until an independent audit could review the segmented risk modeling. The room had heard her. The room had not forgiven her. From that afternoon forward, the air around her changed. Internal meetings began without her. Email threads continued without her. Senior partners she had known since she was a teenager started addressing their answers to Corbin, even when she had asked the question. She was being slowly written out of her own company by people who had decided that her caution was an inconvenience. The gala tonight was the public stage. Corbin had not built a knife. He had built a mirror, and he had filled it with people who'd refused to see her. There was, however, a man near the edge of the catering corridor who had been seeing her for almost an hour. Dante Monroe was 29 years old. He stood a little over 6 feet, with a steady frame that had been built more by carrying things than by lifting them. His suit was navy, of decent cut, but the shoulders had been pressed too many times. He worked in the risk analysis group, 4 levels below Carter Nolan. He was good at his job. He was not good at the politics of his job. The babysitter had cancelled at 5:30 in the afternoon. Dante had put a small navy dress on his daughter. He had brushed her hair gently while she sat on the bathroom counter, holding her stuffed rabbit. He had told her that they would only stay a little while. Matilda Monroe was 6 years old. She had her mother's brown hair and her father's quiet eyes. She had not stopped carrying the small worn rabbit since the morning her mother had stopped coming home from the hospital. Tonight she had been settled on a bench in the family waiting alcove off the side corridor. From his post near the service entrance, Dante had drifted into observation. He had noticed a pattern. Every time a tall woman in a dark blue gown walked toward a circle, the circle adjusted. Not violently. Not visibly. Just enough. A shoulder turned. A glass was lifted to obscure a face. No one was rude. Everyone was excellent. The exclusion was perfect. Dante recognized the choreography. He had seen it once, 2 years earlier, at a birthday party, in a brightly lit gymnasium, where Matilda had stood beside the cake table with her rabbit pressed to her chest, and the other children had circled around the bouncing castle, and no one had pushed her, and no one had teased her, and no one had invited her in. He had watched his small daughter rearrange her face into a careful, practiced smile that no child of 6 should ever need to learn. He saw the same smile now, on a woman he did not know, standing in a room she had inherited from her father. Matilda tugged gently at the cuff of his sleeve. She tilted her head up, her voice barely above the music. "Daddy," she asked, "why is nobody talking to that lady?" Dante did not answer. He bent down to Matilda's height and adjusted the small ribbon at the neck of her dress, and he told her that the lady's name was Miss Pierce, and that she was someone important, and that he was watching. Across the room, Rosalind walked, slowly, toward a cluster of bankers near the windows. An older man in a slate gray suit looked up when she approached and offered a brief, exact greeting. He said good evening in the same tone he might have used to acknowledge a cousin he disliked at a family funeral, and immediately turned his face back toward Corbin Vale, who was standing 2 arms away, holding court. The greeting had been a receipt. Nothing more was due. She moved on. She tried Veronica Hayes, a senior director of strategic communications. Veronica answered Rosalind's question in 3 sentences, and then lifted her phone to take a call that was not ringing. The disappearance was beautifully done. She drifted closer to Henry Brooks, the general counsel. Henry saw her. Henry hesitated. For 1 full second, he looked as though he was about to step forward and ask her something genuine. Then his eyes went past her to Corbin, and his hesitation closed like a door, and he gave her a small polite nod and excused himself toward the bar. She stopped near the edge of the dance floor. She lifted her champagne flute. She did not drink. She let the cool of the glass press into her fingers because the cold gave her something to feel that was not the eyes she could no longer see and could feel turning away from her in a slow, coordinated tide. Amanda Gray, who had spent 4 years working closely under Rosalind, walked past and almost stopped. Almost. Her chin moved very slightly toward Rosalind. Her lips parted as if she might say something, and then her eyes flicked to the cluster around Corbin, and she chose. She turned. She kept walking. Dante saw the moment Amanda chose. He understood it without judging it. People did not always do the wrong thing because they hated. Sometimes they did the wrong thing because they could not afford to be brave that night. Matilda watched too. She did not understand boards or mergers. She understood that a tall lady in a long blue dress was alone. She turned her face up to her father once more and said, very quietly, "She looks like she wants to leave, but she is trying not to." Dante did not answer. He looked at his daughter. He looked at the woman across the room. He thought about what a man teaches a child by what he chooses to do, when no one would blame him for choosing to do nothing. The string quartet eased into the closing bars of its piece, and a small tap of a microphone announced that the formal portion of the evening had begun. Corbin Ballet stepped onto the low stage at the eastern end of the ballroom. He wore black, as he always did at the gala, and his silver hair was brushed straight back. He thanked the partners. He thanked the regulators. He thanked the families. He turned to the long photograph of the late Edward Pierce that hung above the eastern arch, and his voice softened into an almost paternal cadence as he spoke of the founder, of the values, of the long sober work of stewardship that defined what he called this house. Then, gently, he began to turn the knife. He said that an institution of this kind could not be governed by the impulses of a single quarter. He said that leadership required the maturity to recognize that hard decisions sometimes wore the costume of soft ones. He said that the firm had been built by men and women who had learned to listen to experience, rather than to the louder voices inside their own heads. He never named her. He did not have to. But the angle of his body, the way his eyes moved across the room, without ever quite landing on the place where she stood, drew an outline around the woman he was describing as clearly as if he had pointed. Rosalind did not move. She kept her expression level. But the man near the catering corridor saw her dark eyes take on the distance of a person trying to remember the precise tone of her father's voice on a morning long ago, and failing. The applause came in waves. It is a referendum on safety. The people who were not certain what to think simply followed the people who clapped first. The quartet began a slow piece. Corbin stepped down and offered his arm to a senior female partner from a regional bank. He guided her onto the dance floor. He let his small procession glide so close to where Rosalind was standing that his sleeve nearly brushed her arm. The center of the room had moved, and it had not moved toward her. Other couples followed. The floor filled. Rosalind stood at the edge with her champagne flute, and the chandelier light fell on her bare shoulders, and not one hand reached for her. Matilda looked up at her father one more time. "Maybe she needs one friend," she said. It was the simplest sentence anyone had said in the room all night. Dante did not move at once. He stood very still, the way a man stands at a curb before stepping into traffic he respects. He understood exactly what would happen if he crossed the floor. He had no power. He had no shares. He had a job that paid a salary he considered fair. He had a small apartment on the north side of the city. He had health insurance that covered his daughter's annual checkups. He had a fragile, hard-won architecture of stability that took him 4 years after his wife's death to construct. If Corbin Bale identified him publicly as a sympathizer to Rosalind Pierce, his reports would be shifted. Within 6 months, he would either resign or be quietly redirected. Carter Nolan, his immediate supervisor, already disliked him for having raised questions about a recent risk filing. And they understood all of this in the time it took for the second couple to glide past Rosalind without seeing her. He looked down at Matilda. She was standing very close to him, her small fingers wrapped around the worn ear of her rabbit, her eyes fixed on the woman in the blue dress. He thought about the gymnasium. He thought about the carefully composed smile she had practiced at 6 years old. He had wanted on that day, more than anything else, for one parent in that gymnasium to walk over and ask his daughter to dance. He bent down and spoke quietly to her. He told her to stay near the bench, that he would be back in just a little while. She nodded the careful, serious nod of a child who had been raised by one tired parent. Dante adjusted the cuffs of his old suit. He smoothed the front of his jacket. He walked. The first 10 steps drew no attention. By the 15th step, a server had registered his trajectory. By the 20th, a junior partner had paused in mid-sentence. By the time he reached the open edge of the dance floor, the small ripple of a man crossing toward the chief executive had spread through the room with the strange efficiency of weather. Rosalind saw him approaching. She straightened. Her face shifted into the expression she wore for unscheduled professional encounters. She prepared, even now, even tonight, to be a chief executive. Dante stopped at the proper distance. He did not bow. He did not slouch. He extended one hand, palm open, fingers loose and respectful. "Miss Pierce," he said, in the steady voice of a man who had never asked for anything he did not first earn. "May I have this dance?" For one full second, the room around them stopped breathing. Rosalind looked at his hand. She looked at his face. She did not see flattery in it. She did not see the tilted smile of a man trying to be noticed by senior leadership. She did not see pity. She saw a calm, level attention that was offering her a choice she had not been offered in 3 weeks. She set her champagne flute down on a small standing table without looking at it. She placed her hand in his. He led her onto the floor with the careful courtesy of a man who had been taught early how to be in a room with a woman without crowding her. His right hand found a respectful place at her back. His left hand held hers at a steady height. He did not pull her too close. He did not perform. He simply moved with the music. The quartet was playing a slow waltz, and for the first half of the first measure, every other dancer kept dancing. Then, a senior partner in a charcoal suit, noticed, who had stepped onto the floor with the chief executive, and his rhythm broke. Then, a senior auditor. Then Veronica, Ice. Then Henry Brooks. Then Amanda Gray. The room did not stop dancing. But every face turned, slowly, toward the center of the floor, where a young woman in a midnight blue gown was being seen, plainly, in the room she had inherited. Rosalind spoke first, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "You understand what you have just done." Dante's mouth moved into something that was not quite a smile. "I think I have asked the chief executive of my company to dance," he said. She looked at him. There was almost laughter in her, a tired, amused breath that had not been allowed out for many days. "That is a thinner answer than I expected from someone in risk." "I was not certain a thicker answer would help," he said. He paused, and then, more quietly, he added, "No one should have to stand alone in the room they helped build." She did not answer at once. She had heard, in the past 3 weeks, a great many sentences arranged with a great deal of care. The line he had just spoken had not been engineered. It had simply been said. It landed in the part of her that the polished sentences had not been able to reach. "Why?" she asked. "Did you walk over here?" Eddie did not turn it into a story. He told her simply that his daughter had been overlooked at a birthday party 2 years earlier, and that he had stood by the wall and watched her practice a polite smile, and that he had decided then that if he ever again saw a person in a room agree to be invisible, he would not stand by the wall. "Her name is Matilda," he said. Rosalind let her gaze travel, across his shoulder, past the chandelier light, to the small girl in the navy dress, holding a rabbit by the bench at the edge of the corridor. Matilda was watching them with the absolute attention of a child witnessing the difference between what adults say and what adults do. Rosalind smiled. It was the first smile of the evening that had not been built. It was the kind of smile a person has when something inside her unclenches. "Tell me about her." It told her briefly that Matilda was 6, and that she liked drawing horses, and that her mother had been gone for almost 3 years, and that she carried the rabbit because her mother had given it to her. It did not embellish. The simplicity was its own dignity. The waltz turned. The room kept watching. When the last measure approached, Dante slowed his step. He released her hand, stepped back, inclined his head with the formality of someone who knew exactly what kind of gesture this had been, and prepared to retreat. Then Corbin, Bally stepped onto the floor. Corbin's smile arrived before he did. He approached with the warm, lateral ease of a man stepping into a meeting he had arranged. He set a hand briefly on Dante's shoulder, the way a senior man pats a busboy at a wedding. "And what department do we owe this charming interruption to?" he asked, his voice pitched just loud enough for the surrounding circle to overhear. Risk analysis, sir, Dante said. Ground floor team. Corbin tilted his head a small, theatrical amount. Oh, junior risk. He spoke the word junior, the way a man might speak a name he had decided not to learn. How very charming, Rosalind, that your support tonight has come from the more humble levels of the firm. A small ripple of laughter moved through the cluster. Not because the line was funny, because laughing with Corbin was the safer choice. Rosalind began to speak. Dante did not allow her to need to. He looked at Corbin with the same level calm with which he had crossed the floor. He did not raise his voice. On the lower floors, sir, he said, you tend to hear the cracks before the upper floors feel the building shake. The sentence sat on the air for a moment. It was not rude. It was not insubordinate. It was, in the precise vocabulary of risk, a statement of structural fact, and every senior person in the cluster understood it as such. Two of them stopped smiling. Corbin's eyes shifted. He had been prepared to dismiss a kind man with a daughter and a rented suit. He was not prepared for the grammar this kind man had just used. In my line of work, Dante continued, evenly, the most dangerous thing is not a bad number. The most dangerous thing is when a bad number is made to look better, and then everyone in the room agrees not to ask why. The cluster went very still. Carter Nolan, who had been standing 2 steps behind Corbin's right shoulder, lost color around the mouth. Dante saw it. Rosalind saw it. Corbin saw the other see it, which was the dangerous part. Corbin recovered with the speed of a man who had practiced recovering for 40 years. He laughed lightly. We must be careful, he said, when we use the language of risk in social settings. It can be misread. I am usually careful, sir, Dante said. Especially with risk that has been dressed up to look presentable. Rosalind stepped in then. She thanked Mr. Munro, in the public voice of a chief executive, for the dance. She added that there was a brief operational matter she would like to clarify with him on the side balcony before she returned to her guests. The phrasing was clean. It was procedural. It removed the conversation from the floor without surrendering it. Corbin watched them go. His smile stayed where it had been placed. The muscles behind it did not. As Carter Nolan tried to drift away, Corbin's eyes found him, and for the first time that evening Corbin's center of gravity began very slightly to slip. The side balcony was narrower than the main one and quieter. The glass door closed behind them and shaved the music down to a dull pulse. The city below was a calm spread of gold and white. Cold air moved across the railing. Rosalind did not waste the time. Oh, what do you know about Meridian? Dante did not pretend. He told her, in the steady, exact register of a man who had thought about every word of this answer for several days, that he had been part of the original modeling team for the segmented risk profile. That the first version of the model had flagged a defined cluster of small retirement accounts as carrying a higher exposure rating than the pooled product they were being moved into could responsibly absorb in a soft market. He told her that in the version of the report which had reached the board, that cluster had been folded into a much larger group of higher net worth clients with greater capacity for volatility, and that when the two groups were averaged, the overall risk number became calm. The report did not lie outright. It was simply built so that the dangerous sliver of the population was never visible as a sliver. It told her he had filed a formal note with Carter Nolan, with attached tables, with the timestamp still intact. He told her Carter had called him into the small windowless office on the 38th floor and had told him he was being too sensitive. He told her his note had then disappeared from the active review chain. He told her he still had the original file, with its metadata. He told her he still had a forwarded email, sent from Carter's account to one of Corbin Vale's executive assistants, in which Carter had written, "Make sure the retirement segment does not slow the approval." He told her he also had a system access log showing that the underlying data had been edited in a specific user account after his original analysis was filed and before the cleaned summary went up to the board. Rosalind listened without interrupting. By the time he was done, her face had passed through 3 stages and arrived at the controlled, level stillness that had returned to her in the dance. She asked him, quietly, why he had not come to her sooner. Dante did not perform for the question. He told her the truth. He told her that he had been afraid. He told her that his daughter needed her health insurance, and that her school tuition was not small, and that he did not have a wealthy family standing behind him to catch the fall. He told her that he did not consider himself brave. She did not blame him. Fear does not make you wrong, she said. It made you wait. Time you chose the right moment. I am not certain I chose the right moment, he said. I only knew that if I kept standing still, my daughter would learn to stand still. Rosalind looked through the glass toward the bench at the corridor, where the small girl in navy was visible, holding her rabbit, watching for her father. She made her decision then. She would not detonate this on a ballroom floor. She would act inside procedure. She would act in front of witnesses. She would act tonight. She told him quietly what she needed him to do in the morning. She told him whose name to send the files to. She told him that beginning at this hour, she still had at least one functioning hand on the wheel, and that hand would close. When they returned through the glass door, the music had thinned, and the room was beginning to drift toward the small territory of late evening conversation. Rosalind did not pause. She moved across the marble floor with a calm that the room felt before it could name, and she stepped up onto the low stage where Corbin had stood an hour before. Dante did not follow her up. He stayed below, half a step behind, where a witness belongs. She lifted the microphone. The string quartet folded its bows down. The room turned. She did not raise her voice. There are nights, she said, when a firm is judged not by what it earns, but by what it is willing to look at when looking is uncomfortable. 200 faces lifted toward her. She did not name Meridian outright. She did not name Corbin. She told the room, in the precise vocabulary of governance, that questions had been raised about the integrity of segmented risk modeling tied to a pending acquisition, and that she was, with the authority granted to her by the company's charter, freezing all executive approvals tied to that transaction until an independent audit could be completed. Corbin moved first. He stepped toward the edge of the stage with the small, indulgent expression of a senior man preparing to gently correct a junior one in public. Rosalind, he said, this is hardly the appropriate forum for an internal matter. She looked down at him. She did not blink. No, Corbin, she said. The inappropriate forum is the one in which a firm asks its clients to trust it while refusing to verify its own numbers. Henry Brooks, the general counsel, was standing about 15 feet from the stage. He had known, for at least 9 days, that something had moved in the underlying file. He had not been brave. He had also not been able to forget. His knees, which he had ruined a long time ago, locked. He stepped forward. He cleared his throat, in the dry administrative cadence of a man who had spent 20 years writing certifications, and he said that under the company's charter, the chief executive carried the explicit authority to suspend any transaction during which questions of data integrity had been raised, and that the legal department would, effective immediately, preserve the relevant system records overnight. He turned to 2 members of internal security and gave them a small, exact instruction. They nodded. It was not theater. It was procedure. Procedure, applied at the right moment, is the only thing in a room like that one which a man like Corbin Bale could not openly resist without confessing. Amanda Gray was looking at the floor. Veronica Ice was looking at Amanda. 2 senior partners who had been laughing with Corbin 20 minutes earlier had taken a half step back from him. The room's center of gravity slid, a measured distance toward the woman on the stage. Rosalind continued Emily. She said that this firm had been built by people who believed that a client's savings was not a number on a slide. That every account, however small, belonged to a person who had spent a life earning it. That if the firm ever forgot that, it would no longer be a legacy, only a machine wearing a legacy's clothes. Carter Nolan, somewhere near the back of the room, tried to leave through the service corridor. Two of the security staff, who had received Henry's quiet instruction, asked him with great courtesy to remain on the floor for the time being in order to assist with the preservation of his account credentials. A stayed. Corbin stood very still. His face did not break. His hand did, very slightly, around the rim of his glass. He had been beaten by a procedural sentence delivered without anger. When Rosalind set down the microphone, the room did not applaud. The room exhaled. It was a different silence than the one she had walked into at 37 minutes past 8. It was the silence of 200 people realizing, almost at the same moment, that they had spent the night standing in the wrong place. Down at the foot of the stage, near the corridor, a small girl in a navy dress let go of her father's hand and clapped. Twice. 3 small, careful claps from a 6-year-old who had not understood a single sentence about charters or modeling or independent audits, but who had understood perfectly that the lady in the long blue dress was no longer alone. The gala did not so much end as it dissolved. The senior partners began to drift toward the elevators with the careful, measured pace of people who wanted to be observed, leaving in a dignified manner and not in a retreat. The string quartet packed its instruments quietly. Cerebrers gathered, abandoned flutes from the side tables. The chandeliers stayed bright, but the light in the room had changed character. Rosalind stood near the side balcony, looking out at the city. She was tired in the way that did not show in photographs. She had not won the war. Corbin was not gone. The Meridian file was not yet undone. The board would meet in the morning, and the slow granular work of removing a man like Corbin Vale from the architecture of a 60-year-old firm would take months. But she had recovered the one thing that she had been losing all evening, and that thing was the right to speak the truth in her own room. Dante guided Matilda toward the central elevator. He did not want to extend the visibility of what he had done. Matilda was rubbing one eye with the back of her wrist, the rabbit pressed firmly under the other arm. Rosalind crossed the marble toward them. She approached as a woman who knew, with great clarity, what had been given to her tonight and by whom. She thanked him, quietly, for the dance. It told her that she did not need to thank him. It said that any of the people in that room could have done what he did. But did not, she said. It was a short sentence. It carried the weight of the entire evening. Matilda looked up at her. Neat. Rosalind, who had spent the night in heels, designed for a stage, lowered herself with care until she was nearly at the small girl's height. She was no longer a chief executive. She was a tired, young woman who had survived a long room. Are you okay now? Matilda asked. Rosalind smiled. The smile was small and tired, and entirely true. I think, she said, I am better than I was. Matilda nodded with the seriousness of a child who had been given a satisfactory answer to a serious question. Rosalind told Dante, quietly, that in the morning he would forward his original files directly to Constance Miller, the independent auditor who had worked with her father for 20 years, and that Henry Brooks had already initiated the system preservation. She told him that no action of any kind that touched his employment, his reviews, his compensation, or his standing in the firm would proceed without her sign-off, and that this was not a favor to him. It was a procedural protection against retaliation, and it was already in writing. He did not respond like a man who had been rescued. He nodded, and said he would follow procedure. She looked at him for a moment longer. You did not save me from a party tonight, she said. You reminded me that I am not allowed to let them rewrite the truth. You always knew the truth, he said. I just did not want you to be standing alone with it. The elevator chimed. Dante took his daughter's hand. Matilda turned at the threshold and lifted her small fingers in a wave. Rosalind, who had not waved at anyone in 3 weeks, without calculating what the wave would cost her, raised her hand and waved back. The doors closed. She stood for a long moment in the marble lobby of the floor she had inherited, alone again, but not in the way she had been alone at the start of the evening. The first solitude had been the solitude of a woman whose room had agreed to forget her. This solitude was the solitude of a woman whose room had remembered. She walked back, slowly, across the empty floor toward the windows. The city below was steady. Tomorrow, there would be auditors. There would be lawyers. There would be a board meeting, and there would be a slow, exact, procedural unwinding of a quiet attempt to push a generation of small clients into a danger they had not been told about. But tonight, for the first time in 3 weeks, when she lifted her hand, it was not to hold a glass against the cold of a room. It was simply to rest her fingers, briefly, against the warm pane of the window, and to look out, and to breathe. Real kindness, in the end, is not the soft thing the world pretends it is. It is the moment when an ordinary person walks across a hard floor toward a person the room has decided to forget and offers, with no particular hope of reward, a hand that says, simply, "You are not alone here." The rest of what follows, the audits, the resignations, the slow correction of the record, can only happen because someone, first, refused to let the silence finish its work. That was the work that was done in Pierce Tower on the night when the chief executive was left alone at her own gala, until a single father asked her to dance.